foreigners taking their jobs, taking their women. They're like entitled to a given life that has been robbed of them by some nefarious group. You know, usually they say like it's the Jews or the deep state or feminazis. There's a lot of stuff. It's complicated, but they're fascists. They want Trump to win because if he does, that gives them permission to the permission and power to begin like restructuring the country to their desired image. And that would not look good for you or even for them, by the way. Fascism doesn't tend to work out well for the fascists either. You know, it inevitably burns itself out and a lot of people are hurt or killed in the process. It's not like, you know, this process makes life better for the average like white guy or whatever. It's just they tend to be the ones suckered into it. You know, you've got like the mad like incel types online who genuinely think that liberals want to, you know, import the third world to impregnate all the beautiful white women they think ought to be their girlfriend or something. It sounds silly, but so is fascism. What do you want from me? The bourgeoisie as a class are generally aligned towards fascism in an era of populism where people are increasingly distrustful of institutions. People want to be fed messages that confirm their populist beliefs, their critical eye towards institutions. After 2008, you know, you have the financial crisis, you have the subprime mortgage crisis, you have like rising inflation now, you have this feeling of job insecurity because of the gig economy and because of the way the modern globalized like economic superstructure functions. A lot of people feel like life right now is fragile and tenuous and bureaucratic and alienating and unconcerned with their needs. So they're populist. They want fundamental changes. Liberals tend to be bad at promising fundamental changes because they are very institutionally inclined. Fascists love to promise sweeping changes. Will they actually do them? Sometimes, you know. Hitler talked a big game about workers' rights and dismantling, you know, autocratic and oppressive corporations when he was not in power. And then when he was in power, man loved big business. So, you know, people are often, you know, Hitler, when he's out of power, all big business is Jewish and it's screwing the average German over. Hitler, when he is in power, actually big business is great. You know, get along with the bourgeoisie. They have your best interests at heart. They don't have your best interests at heart, folks. They don't, trust me. So the bourgeoisie also tend to align with right-leaning populism because left-leaning populism is usually critical of capitalism as an institution, and businesses don't like it when countries become critical of capitalism because then you start nationalizing industry and yeah, it's a whole rigmarole, right? So these are the groups that Donald Trump is being puppeted by. And I'm speaking very generally here. I'm not trying to speak conspiratorially. You know, the idea of a president being beholden to interests is not new and not specific to Trump. It is just important in my mind to understand where this is all coming from. You know, Trump has been making a lot of wild claims lately, like a flat 20% tariff on the entire world. I don't think he's actually going to do that because it would be very bad for the economy if he did so. And so much of his support comes from the bourgeoisie, the capital interests, big business, that it would be strange for them to pressure Donald Trump into implementing a policy that would hurt their businesses very badly. It might benefit some businesses, but as a class, the bourgeoisie tend to prefer free trade, which is for the most part what American economic policy is leaned into. So I think that Trump is just basically saying shit, and whatever like eccentric, irrational policies and suggestions we get from him are just a consequence of him being an imperfect puppet. He's not like J.D. Vance, you know? He's not like Ron DeSantis, you know? He's not like a little corpo suit you can stuff a hand up into and manipulate like a puppet. Donald Trump is egotistical and narcissistic and probably very difficult to rein in. So even though he's being effectively used as a puppet, he's kind of blabbing, you know? It's not a perfect process, which is why J.D. Vance is the VP pick. He can be controlled, which is why Fox News and a bunch of other right-leaning institutions were leaning in with DeSantis for a while because he can be easily controlled. Trump, not so much, mostly because he's self-absorbed, not because he's like willfully opposed to the idea of being controlled by big business, which he has never really shied away from. With all that in mind, what happens if Trump wins? Well, nothing good. I'm very sorry. I do think a lot of the country would be tanked. I don't think it will be as bad as might be implied by a lot of what Trump and his supporters have said. This is for a few reasons. First of all, a lot of the dismantling that you can do to this country would be detrimental to the extent that it would impact the bottom line for global business. And I really just don't think they're going to be allowed to do that. Remember that historically, reactionary politics have been used as a red herring to get voters to vote against their economic interests. In the early 1900s, when factory workers were leaning into unionizing, the robber barons who owned those factories, the capital class then, pushed racist propaganda to split the white union workers and the black union workers so they would distrust each other rather than unifying against the business owner. We do this today with Latin immigrants from Central and Latin America, Mexico and stuff, we do the exact same thing. Rather than uniting against the autocratic business practices of the owners in our agricultural industry or our factories, we fear the undocumented immigrant or just the documented immigrant coming in and taking our job. If your wages go down, it is not because immigrants came in. It is because your wages were lowered by the guy who employs you. It's like that's the person you should be focusing your antagonism against. Nobody forced the person above you to lower your wages. They chose to do so they could make more money. It's not the fault of any immigrants coming in. And there are studies to back this. But that's how reactionary politics are applied to get people to vote against their own economic interests. That's why you have Trump voters who make like $24,000 a year who will vote for Trump, who is anti-union, even though that very much is against their interest, because they're being fed narratives about how, well, in actuality, preventing the Mexicans would be, even more to their interest. It's always been a red herring. So the modern day Republican Party is kind of like a mix of that strategy, disingenuous reactionary politicking as a way to front pro-business policy, and genuine fascist, we are reactionaries for the sake of being reactionary. To the fascist, being pro-business is good, but it's a secondary consideration to hurting you. Fascism, the distinction between the in-group and the out-group, this is something that can only really be reaffirmed through suffering and ostracization. As a political program, it is one that is not only built on suffering, it mandates it. You can't have fascism in like a manner applied where everyone is living a good life and being given a good shot. Like the in-group, out-group distinction is literally what produces this. It's what makes the difference. So even if a program hurts everyone, as long as it hurts the outgroup more, that's beneficial to the fascist. The Republican Party is a mix of both the sincerely reactionary and the insincerely reactionary. In practice, how much of a difference does it make if they're willing to work together? Not too much, but I think it's worth focusing on the distinction and that line, because the more the Republican Party leans into the reactionary for the sake of reactionary side of things, the more Trump's victory would really suck. If we assume the Republican Party is mostly still adhering to the old doctrine, we will front reactionary politics to make it easier to get people to vote for pro-business policies, Trump's 4 years will suck, but the main priority will be business as usual. Not that different really from like a neocon presidency, but done more incompetently and with a lot more media bluster and virtue signaling about how much minority groups are hurting the country. If the Republican Party leans more into fascist and reactionary for reactionary's sake, your ass is going to the camps, my friends. I'm really sorry. Not really. I am sorry. I'm saying not really to the camps thing. I mean, maybe. Like, Donald Trump is pledging to deport 20 million, 25 million, 50 trillion people. He's saying that he'll deport even legal immigrants. This is an insane policy if you care about business outcomes. It would be ruinous to this country economically, socially. It's almost impossible to do. We're talking about like a mass exodus, an ethnic cleansing, a routing, a deportation of people that is basically unprecedented in human history. A widespread, prolonged, years duration campaign led by, in all likelihood, police and military to oust a